It's a fundamental aspect of the human experience that we can hold simultaneously conflicting beliefs and behaviors. So in this video series, we're going to be talking about cognitive dissonance. Now, cognitive dissonance was coined by Leon Festinger in 1957. Now, this notion that we can hold conflicting beliefs is something that's been around for a long time in human literature and human writings and art. So within the book Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari, he says every man-made order is packed with internal contradictions. Culture is constantly trying to reconcile these contradictions, and this process fuels change. So it's acknowledged that conflict is a fundamental part of human psychology. It's so fundamental that it is introduced in the beginning of the book, How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. In the beginning of the book, he talks about the murderer Two Gun Crowley, and what was happening is that he had just murdered a police officer, and the police were coming after him and about to get him. And you think about this, how does a murderer view themselves? How do they deal with the notion that they're such a bad human being psychologically? And it turns out in his case, and in many of these cases, they don't believe that they did anything wrong. So Two Gun Crowley was writing, before the police captured him, he wrote that under my coat is a weary heart, but a kind one that would do nobody any harm. So he actually fundamentally thought he was a good person. This is one of the values that we generally have, is that we generally view ourselves as good people. And Schwartz has actually done some research to identify some universal human values. And it's helpful to understand these values if you want to understand how our beliefs can contradict with each other. So he identified 10 values that were common across different cultures by giving them lists of descriptors and asking them how much those descriptors described a fundamental belief that they had about themselves as an individual. And across all of these cultures, some common values were security, tradition, conformity, benevolence, self-direction, achievement, hedonism, power, universalism, and stimulation. And these 10 values generally fall within 4 segments, which include openness to change, self-enhancement, conservation, and self-transcendence. Now, these 10 values can be arranged in a circle. And the reason they're arranged in a circle is because values that oppose themselves on the circle tend to be in conflict with each other. For example, the values that represent openness to change conflict with conservation. So individuals who are open to new things and changes generally embrace more excitement and variability in their lives, and this conflicts with the value of security and traditionalism and following society's norms. So they conflict with each other. So the notion that our beliefs can conflict is embedded in human psychology. And one of the reasons why that probably is the case is that our goals can be directed at ourselves to benefit ourselves, but they can also be directed to benefit our family or to benefit our community or high-level human ideals like culture and religion and government. So sometimes we act in ways that aren't optimal for the individual, and it can be a bit perplexing. Football is very common. These are individuals who are running into each other at high speeds, knocking their heads against each other, and risking mental and physical health. This is not something that's optimized for an own person's individual benefit. And sometimes people sacrifice their time and their physical abilities for others. For example, in their employment, they might work a job to benefit their family, to benefit their kids. The act of doing that behavior doesn't directly benefit them. It benefits something at a larger picture. And then there's military service, where people actually sacrifice their lives for something that's beyond them. They make sacrifices for their country, which involves the ideals and beliefs, fundamental human beliefs behind that culture. They make sacrifices for basically human ideas. Cognitive dissonance is something that's prevalent within everybody. It's something that we all live with. And one of the most striking examples is in our own health. So one case of that is that we are all aware of the danger that we put ourselves in by getting inside a metal vehicle that travels at high speeds down the road with a bunch of other strangers who are also traveling at high speeds in these gigantic heavy vehicles, right? This is a big risk to our health, the threat of getting into a car accident. And yet every day we get into our car and we give very little thought. We're not very influenced in our behavior by the notion that we're putting ourselves at risk by doing this. So that's one example of dissonance, is that when you encounter the knowledge about how risky car driving is, and then you basically disregard that knowledge and don't completely account for that information in your behavior. Another example is that we generally regard ourselves as being healthy. And so when we're confronted with new information, for example, a major illness, then we have to make changes in the way we perceive ourselves based on that information. And that creates a lot of dissonance. And so there are circumstances where people can be diagnosed with cancer and they simply don't believe that they have cancer. They simply are in denial about these serious diseases that they might get. And an interesting example of this comes from a TED Talk, which I'll link to below, about Michael Friedman, who was a fixture in American theater, and he was a songwriter, and he was diagnosed with HIV and then AIDS, and he ended up dying of AIDS within 2 months. And so he clearly felt cognitive dissonance about this notion that he sees himself as a healthy person. He doesn't see himself as somebody who has HIV and AIDS and whose life is at risk. He was incapable of seeing that, and so he never got the treatment in time that he would have needed. And as a result, he did not communicate it with his friends and family, and so it came as a shock to them. And an article popped up saying, why did this happen? Why did he die of AIDS when we don't think this is something that still happens in the year 2017? And so that was cognitive dissonance for many people as well, in the notion that we didn't think this was still happening. Well, actually, it is still happening, but they didn't think it was. And so they had to update their beliefs to acknowledge the reality that in 2017, there are people who are still dying from AIDS. So in this first video, we introduced the notion of cognitive dissonance and the idea that it actually represents a fundamental aspect of human psychology, and that our beliefs and our behaviors often are contradictions. They often conflict with each other. This is the first video of a 3-part series. So in the second video, we'll go into the scientific study of cognitive dissonance and the work of Leon Festinger. And in the third video, we're going to go into the application of cognitive dissonance and considering it in marketing. So thanks for checking out this video. Hit the subscribe and that bell if you want to be notified of our new posts. We're posting regularly about human psychology. So hit the like if you like this video, and feel free to share it on social media if that's something you'd like to do. Thanks for checking this out.